Hello, everyone. What I'm about to tell you is going to be terrifying. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be something out of nightmares. So if that scares you, if the word compromise scares you, look away. I urge you, look away right now. But if you decide to stay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to delve deep into compromise. Let's get to it. Imagine you're creating a game. You're developing your great game. You have a fantastic idea. You have a plan. Maybe you have a team. Maybe you're doing it on your own. Anywho, you can see it in the horizon. It's going to be a great game. So you start working on it. And soon enough, it turns out that not everything is going exactly to plan. Maybe you don't have enough budget, maybe something else happens, but day by day, you realize time is running short, budget is running short, and you have to start compromising on your original idea. And, so far so good. It still seems like you're going to make your final goal of getting the good game out. And right now, it's no longer great, it's good, but it's still the game you wanted to make. Fast forward a few months, maybe years, maybe decades, depending on how your development goes, and boom, you come up with the final result, which is your game that you planned. But then again, maybe it's not. Because in the meantime, as you progress through the production, you had to make a lot of compromises, or maybe just the one, but one that struck your game and its soul at its heart. So why did this happen? Why did the compromise lurk into your production? I mean, you had this great idea. It was solid, right? So compromise, we are taught that compromise is nothing bad. On the opposite, we are taught that compromise is the way to coexist with other people within societies. If you're paying any attention to what's going on in Poland, you know this is not exactly true. And this boils to the very simple fact, which was nicely spelled out by Larry David, which says that a good compromise is when both parties are dissatisfied, which immediately implies that the parties that are trying to compromise actually have somewhat opposing interests, or maybe the subset of their joint interest is so small that it doesn't really encourage heading into a singular direction that will be good for both the parties. So either both parties are dissatisfied, no one's satisfied, or things are not going to happen. And what is terrifying is that in the real world, maybe sometimes this has applications because there's no other way to go. But in terms of game development and in terms of any creative endeavor, what happens is if you decide to compromise on the quality of your game, not only does the game lose in terms of quality, but you lose because the interest of the game being as best as it can and your interest as a creator of that game to get the game out in the best shape possible is co-directed. It's the same thing. So if you try to compromise with your game, technically you are trying to compromise with yourself, so you lose twice. You're not happy, and the game, if it could speak, is not happy because the quality degrades. And who voices the disconcern of the game? The players. Maybe they don't like parts of it, maybe they don't like the entire game, and all of this could have been avoided. So why am I telling you about this, and why do I want to delve into this subject? I have my fair share of experiences, both in terms of AAA games, working in Lionhead Studios, Microsoft Studios, as well as on Witcher 3, CD Projekt Red, and also on independent titles that were made by Robot Gentleman, where I'm currently the creative and tech director. And I can tell you that each of these projects, even the ones that I was running as a game director and had a lot of control over, had to face and confront the menace of compromises at different stages of development, both in terms of design and later development and the release. I'm going to tell you a bit about compromise today. I'm going to outline how does it exactly happen that the compromise comes to exist in the development of your game. I'll also look through the potential impacts that the compromises may have on the quality of your game. And finally, I'll tally up the whole concept of compromise in game development by exploring a few things that can be done to actually avoid compromise. Now, bear in mind, this is very anecdote-driven. I'm trying to root this as much as I can in evidence because this is the best way to counter compromise, in fact. But different people may have different experiences with compromise and different origins of compromise, especially. So treat this talk as a pointer, as a means of trying to focus your attention on the potential problem that you might be facing. Maybe you've already faced it, but you couldn't name it. And it turns out after this talk that it was indeed compromise. And I hope that this will give you enough fuel to not only confront compromise, but also to solve the issues that arise because of the compromise. To quote one of the bands that I quite like, even an end has a start. And one could say that origin of every compromise is exactly the beginning of an end of something. Unless you're able to circumvent the specific direction in which the compromise puts you in, you might end up facing a lot of problems in the development. You might face the end impact, but in the worst case scenario, this might actually derail your development process completely, causing you to finish without the game that you were setting out to make. Maybe it will not be completed at all, or maybe it will just be an okay-ish game instead of the great game that you planned. So starting with origins that might be described as based on the pre-production design level, one of my favorites is the lack of a nominated decision maker. What this implies is that despite the fact that the decision process is ongoing, there is no single authority which funnels the decision and doesn't take responsibility for decisions that are to be made, which would push the process of development of the game forward. And there's two reasons for that. One very simple reason is that the decision maker was not appointed, and sometimes this is very deliberate because maybe the team has a flat structure, or maybe someone is attempting a very democratic process in which all of the team members are involved in decision making. In these cases, this is more controlled, and it might be a compromise by decision. We'll talk about that later. But the worst case possible with this is when this just happens. This happens organically. There's a team, they're working on a feature or a number of features, and suddenly it becomes apparent that someone has to take responsibility for deciding about the future of the thing that they're doing. And sadly, research confirms that people are have a lot of tendencies to actually avoid taking responsibility into their own hands. And one obvious reason for that would be, well, they just don't want to be responsible for a problematic, for a wrong decision. But the worst scenario is that it's not actually that they're trying to push the responsibility away. It's that they find the status quo of uncertainty, like a fuzzy responsibility situation, comforting, and they actually prefer to keep it that way. What happens then is this can prolong decisions for an indefinite amount of time because no one is really happy to step forward and actually take the responsibility and decide. If you ever did a school group project, I think you'll know what I'm talking about because these were always source of a lot of troubles and struggles with people not wanting to be responsible for whatever happens next. And in the end, maybe the one person who decided to be the brave one stepped in front of everyone and finished the project on their own. Maybe it was you. Of course, there's also a problem of the fact that maybe the nomination for decision maker is caused by a clash of personalities with people not agreeing on who's supposed to take over. This is also an issue. In the end, even if a decision maker is made, maybe in a fuzzy way, so there's like 3 people debating, they're trying to make the decision together. And this turns into Origin 2, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard in terms of design, which is designed by committee. There is a running anecdote which is nicely pictured on this image, where it is said that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. And as far as truth goes, camels are cool animals. So that is a disservice to the camel. But it is true that democratized decision making is a terrible idea if it involves design by committee. Because while every design process and also decision making is a collaborative process, because there's always input from different people, even if there's one person funneling this decision at the end and making that decision on their own, there's always input from other people. Designed by a committee implies that people involved in the decision making have equally valued opinions and evaluations, which might be okay in some cases, but most of the time it doesn't work with things that are as subjective as creative endeavors. Creative endeavors don't really work well with generic answers and solutions. And the key is that the attempt to make everyone input their equally valued opinion does not produce something that is better for the game. It produces something that maybe is better for the group. So in certain situations, it might be that you're actually yielding to one of the people from the group because they have a stronger voice, more authoritative. Some people might have a more submissive approach. It might mix with the problems I described in terms of the decision maker appointment or lack of thereof. But in the end, what happens is that evidence and focusing on the game's best interest loses with opinions and trying to cater to the people involved rather than trying to cater to the game and its content. What happens next is maybe you have the whole decision-making setup figured out and there's no problems with it. But you come to a point where you're trying to actually put the game together. And a lot of times, especially in terms of pitching, we're all encouraged as game developers to provide a very clear, concise picture of what is it that we want to achieve, which is great. And one of the pointers very commonly shared is that when you're pitching, you're supposed to give the audience a point of reference. So you can say, oh, my game is Sims meets Age of Empires would be an interesting game. So you pitch your game like that. Even though you don't have the game to show, maybe you just have a few descriptions and maybe a few concept images, but it allows you to create a mental image in the head of the person you're pitching to. And this is fine in terms of trying to draw the picture for others when you're still working out presentable content from the game. The problem is if this actually reverses, and this is the same thing that influences you in your work. There's a difference between inspiration and templating. While for our newest game, for instance, which funnily enough has a very long GDD, 350 pages to be exact, it has a very developed section on references. And there's a lot of inspiration in terms of gameplay, art direction, sound direction, music direction, etc. But despite the fact that we analyze the references quite extensively and we use them when concepting the game, we never decided, and I urge you not to do that, to actually take a one-to-one approach and template something. What happens, we've seen this happen a lot of times with, a good game comes out and you get inspired by it. And just to name a few, XCOM, Doom, you've heard the terms Doom clone, XCOM clone. Right now, Among Us is very popular and you're already getting Among Us clones, which pretty much what they do is what the early indie games did, early in this decade, right after 2010, when you had a lot of indie puzzle games. There was this notion of getting a cool puzzle game out, the next one, but it wouldn't be the same one as the one that you know. It's another puzzle game with a twist. And the twist was supposed to make the difference. And while, when there were a couple of dozen games released every year, that maybe made sense. But right now, with thousands and thousands of games released, doing a little twist is not something that justifies the effort to actually play your game. And the fact that someone did Among Us in 3D is not a good justification for playing that game. There was an interesting problem with this in terms of clones. If you heard about Ridiculous Fishing from Vlambeer, what happened was not only someone did clone their game successfully on a platform they weren't on yet, but then there was nothing they could do because gameplay is not patented, so people can do that. So sometimes you can get away with it, but it's not because you're actually trying to make a better game. It's because you're trying to do something that is morally, ethically questionable. At the same time, we have a situation where we have a number of inspirations for our next game, but if we didn't control this can easily turn into a templating effort as well. So you always need to be wary when you're working with your own developments that inspiration has to stay an inspiration. It cannot offer you answers to every question that you have in your game, because if that happens, you are templating, and this will hurt your game in the end because it's not your vision, it's someone else's, probably in a weird way combined with your vision, which will not necessarily yield an interesting game. You hopped over those troubles, and maybe you think it's safe now. Sadly, it isn't. Especially in terms of development, when you're in the midst of production, it's easy to get caught up in an endless iteration loop. And the troubles I mentioned before with decision-making especially support this problem where you keep spinning around trying to get the right answer, but you just can't seem to get to the point. And at a certain point, the frustration comes in and you just want to close that loop, but you don't have the answer yet. So what do? There's only two potential solutions. You either keep iterating, which pretty much derails the process because it just makes the frustration that much worse in the end. And the end result is that you close that loop, but usually just deciding on the answer that is readily available. And this is not the worst of the best answers. It is if you're lucky. Most likely it's just the answer that you have. And it's not optimal for your game. It is something that you're forced to choose because you just no longer can stand that loop. So delays or a compromise solution, this is the lost situation that you don't want to find yourself in. Why does it happen? I mean, it might be lack of confidence because people just can't seem to make up their minds and if their answers are good enough, or maybe a lack of responsibility, which, as I mentioned, links back to the decision-making process. On the other hand, it might be that you managed to find the answers to your problems and you pushed out the solutions, or maybe you planned the solutions, but in the end, later in development, you find out that the features you implemented, the parts of the game that you thought were done and ready, are actually not there. Either they're not working properly, or maybe they're not there at all, because you finished combining all the parts of your game, and suddenly it turns out, wow, the game is not as I envisioned it. This is a common problem for late development process, usually what happens is, especially if you have inexperienced teams or you're inexperienced yourself, you're trying to get the game together at the very end, a couple of months before, luckily it's a couple of months before the release date. And it turns out that not everything is coming together. If you didn't plan accordingly, you will be faced with delays because of all the problems that arise. If you concepted certain things in the wrong way, these problems will manifest oftentimes in systems and features that perhaps have no direct connection to what you were doing, but because they're now glued together, it turns out that in fact there is a direct correlation with something bad happening in one place affecting another part of the game, be it a technical thing, be it a design, balance thing, or maybe even such a thing as, mismatched art assets, where one part of the game is assets are done in one resolution, the other part of the game, assets are done in a different resolution, and you just have to normalize this, and this becomes another problem to solve. There's a common misconception of what is done and what is done. It's a nice term to remember. When someone tells you their task is done, that just means they think it's done in terms of their workload that was associated with that task. But the second life of a task is actually having the feature that was implemented as part of it be conjoined with all the other features of the game and fitting into the bigger picture. And that's only when you can say that the thing is done, when you see it working in a game and, it's tested and it doesn't crash and burn your entire project. Now we're getting to the good stuff, because this is a moment where you actually you can evaluate what's going on with the final version of your game, the final picture that you were trying to build and give to your audience. You get some sort of end result. It might be in terms of individual pieces of the game. It might be in terms of the end result of the entire game. So you can play it and you can evaluate it. And it turns out it's just not good enough. And good enough is a very relative term. I quite enjoy discussing it, because it seems very obvious to me that when you say good enough, it pretty much boils down to your skills in terms of attention to detail. So if there's anything wrong or anything off of what you're doing, as a professional, you should be doing the best you can to make it good, to make the problems disappear. Sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes you don't know things, but in the end, everything is solvable, provided you have the right attitude, you do the right research, maybe you look twice on your work. But oftentimes, this is completely misunderstood in the way that good enough is just equal to delivery, which, you can order a pizza, and if the pizza comes and it's the best pizza you've ever eaten, that's probably well above your good enough standards, because you wanted a good pizza and you got a great pizza. But if you order a pizza and you're expecting a good pizza, at least a good pizza, and then it comes and it's all greasy and it's actually leaking through the box, then, the fact that the pizza arrived at your door, even on time, is a little consolation if it just dripped all over your hands and you can't really stomach it. And this is pretty much the same in terms of what you get from development. And the reasons for below good enough standards is lack of experience, which is the only justifiable reason, really, because that just means someone has to study more. Get the experience. The problem is that people need to realize that's the thing they need to do. The other thing is confidence, which is problematic, because if someone takes the responsibility of doing X, you would expect them to have enough confidence to deliver X. So that's a bigger problem, because you can try to teach people confidence, but in the end, they have to make up their own confidence. The end problem here might be, and this is a common problem, unfortunately, it's lack of professional conduct. It's pretty much incompetence disguised by saying, well, good enough is relative, so we delivered. So what are you complaining about? As a studio, we have a number of experiences like that. And actually, that's one of the reasons we are very hesitant to do outsourcing these days, because we had a lot of trouble with getting trusted partners that we know would deliver consistently good work, good results. So when you're talking to someone and you tell them, you provide them feedback that this is not good, and the answer is that you expect too much, and we're not talking about you being super arrogant and ignorant, not understanding what you're asking for, which is a common, there's a lot of anecdotes about people, clients asking for art assets or anything that is just, or they're ordered in a stupid way and they're asking the impossible, or just plain want to take advantage of the offer, then this is not an acceptable answer, because you want people to be on the same level as you, or at least on the level that is acceptable for you. This kind of develops into what I call the good craftsmanship tale, which is when you have a situation where people involved in development are not really inexperienced. They're experienced and they have good skill and they produce good quality of work, but the work is just not good in the end. Like, it's good technically, it's all there, it's done according to the best practices or whatnot, but in the end, when you review it and you put it in the big picture, it just doesn't stick. It's not memorable, and it affects the whole game in ways that are not necessarily visible at the time when they're developing these assets or these pieces of the game, which is a huge danger, because you're looking at this one picture and when you're supposed to provide feedback and it all looks good and you're like, yeah, this is nice, good skill, it fits with the game style, it's good, and then you put it in the game and it's just wrong. And all of that builds up to something that happens very often, which is the failure to observe the big picture. There is an incorrect quote, or rather incorrectly attributed to Aristotle, because he said something a bit different, but the cleverness of it is actually worth remembering, which is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The fact that you have a number of pieces that are good does not mean that the end result is good, because the end result has to be judged on different factors than the individual pieces that compose it. And you have to be aware of that. You want the individual pieces to be of good quality, but in the end, it is the final construction that you're doing that needs to be good. If you're building a house and the windows are fantastic, but the walls are terrible and the whole thing will fall down, I mean, it doesn't matter that someone did a good job with the windows. The house will just fall down or look terrible, and the windows will not save it. So you have to keep that in mind, especially that the problems may come from both in a kind of centralized person or people or teams, where management or project leads fail to see the big picture, and they notice it too late, or they don't notice it, and then the players notice it, and it's a problem. On the other hand, there's a lot of issues with individual contributors, developers, not understanding the scope of the big picture, even though they are actively feeding their work into it. And both parties have to be on board to actually make the end results satisfactory in terms of quality. So remember, what you want to think about always, no matter what your position in the company is to have a holistic perspective, to think of the whole, because understanding the full experience of the game is the player's perspective, it's the player's experience, and you want to be in their shoes when thinking about what you're doing for the game, what the game is supposed to be. And even if you manage to get across different problems, there's always the issue of panic. panic sets in when pressures become too much to bear. And pressures result from different things. It might be an external pressure of timeline, of deadlines, of publisher breathing down your neck. It might be internal pressure of internal deadlines or delays or anything like that, budget running out, the general lack of resources. But in the end, panic mode prompts people to make stupid decisions because they have to make them very snappy. And common scenarios here is that people either retreat or try to solve the problems that need solving immediately in a brute force manner. And this never yields good results. Well, sometimes maybe it does, but it's more luck than skill or choice. It's just that you got lucky. And game development is as hard as it is. You don't want to leave anything to luck because there's already plenty of luck involved with getting to the finish line. And in terms of resources, of course, the worst one is time. So I took the liberty of actually separating the origin of time as a separate thing. Urgency to deliver. This is a problem we all have, and it sets in sooner or later. It might be at the end of the project. It might be during the project. There's always some sort of deadline. It might just like you might have, the capacity to develop your game as long as you want, but still there are some interim deadlines that you might plan, and you might be unhappy with yourself and how things are going. This stems from the unpredictability of the game development process and the fact that it requires a lot of skill, a lot of attention, a lot of forward thinking. But the main problem here is time pressure causes you to make compromises, and usually the very usual scenario is, especially at the end of development, you have a number of features that you maybe want to incorporate in the game, but you don't have time for them all. So you have to make the greater good choice where what stays and what doesn't, what you focus on to release the game. The greater good is a very bad choice of words, I think, because you're not choosing the greater good. You're actually choosing the lesser evil, which sounds much more negative, doesn't it? And trying to make this sound positive is not good for evaluating it what it is. And it is actually limiting your choices or actually not having a choice at all, because usually what happens is you can very clearly see what can make it and what can't. And now a whole different question, which I'll explore shortly, is why did that feature need deciding if it's going to make it in the end result? Because you planned for it. So why was it there in the first place? So these are the general origins of compromise that I was able to identify. And of course, there's probably much more, many more specialized, selected origins. But these, I think, are pretty well generalized. What they have all in common is that they impact the quality of your game. It might be in different ways, but in the end, what happens is a bad compromise degrades the quality of your game. This can happen in a number of scenarios. The very common scenario is what I call the lowest common denominator effect, which pretty much happens when the game is great, but there's the one thing that sticks out and it brings the quality of the entire game down. So if I was to give you a good example is the Assassin's Creed 3 had a lot of problems anyway, but as an AI programmer, what I noticed immediately was that the AI in that game was terrible. A subpart to what it was in the previous installments. And despite the fact, that the game might be good looking, the game might have an interesting gameplay, breaking AI or breaking some specific aspect of the game that influences the whole reception of the game causes the experience of that game to be bad or worse. It might even ruin the experience. Like if it's fairly isolated, it might still allow you to, not get people angry, but in the end, you are pretty much shooting yourself in the foot. And if there's a number of these problems of lower quality aspects of the game, this just multiplies because it is so much more noticeable. A very obvious example is also the inconsistent quality. So maybe it's not a specific portion of the game that's terrible. It's not that the AI is terrible. It's just that the behavior of specific NPCs is just, jaw-dropping. Is what are they doing? So what happens is the game shifts from being very good to being worse. And it might not be bad, but it's so much worse than what you're used to that it is very noticeable. And one example I can quote, not from my experience as a developer, but my experience as a gamer, is the Deus Ex Human Revolution, which was a great game. I was actually surprised that it played almost as well as the original Deus Ex. But they had the boss fights that were outsourced to a different company. And while the boss fights were not bad on their own, they were such a departure from the premise of the game, which was you can play in a number of ways. And one of them was stealthy. And when you were playing for confronting the bosses, the stealth element didn't matter in most of the boss fights because you just had to shoot everything you had at them. And, this was immersion breaking because I knew this is something that the game is funneling me into and it is not my choice. And, in certain games, this might work because it might be a conscious choice of the developer to actually face the player with something like that. But it didn't feel like this was the case here. It felt like it was a mistake. And this immediately stood out. And it drew a lot of criticism. And this happens even without compromise because game development is so difficult that it's not easy to get the entire duration of your game to be very even in terms of quality. But anytime you make a compromise, you just increase the risk of this happening. Generic design, I think it's self-explanatory. If you drop the ball on quality and you make compromises that kind of make your game very similar to other games, it just doesn't stand out. And this is the worst thing that can happen to you in this overly saturated market. Everyone develops a game now. There's thousands of games releasing every year. And you might make a good game in terms of, technical quality, craftsmanship. But the players will just not care because either they saw it, a million times before, or what happens is they just don't care because it's not good enough to, warrant their limited time span and attention. It's worth remembering that it's no longer an achievement to release a game. It is if you're learning. It's not if you're actually trying to make a difference and make an interesting, eye-catching game. Time's always a problem. Any mistakes you make and any compromises that have an impact on time will make you suffer. And if you get caught in decision-making, especially prolonged decision-making, certain things will just suffer because it will take so much more time to get them going. And sometimes there are things, and you have to use common sense and your skill and experience to determine what's what, but there are things that need time to mature. So it's not the same qualification for everything. Some things need a year for you to think about and actually develop in a proper way. But if you spend too much time on things that don't need that much time, what might happen is that in the end, despite the fact that you spend more time, maybe effort, you're not getting a quality payoff. So you lost the time twice because not only did you contribute it to something that did not require it, and maybe it was to be predicted, but also you didn't spend that time on something that might have used that. On the opposite side, there is making decisions with little thought. Sometimes there's, again, common sense. There's nothing to think about. Just make up your decision because that's the way to go, because you can always continue iterating on things that don't seem to fit in the grand scheme of things. But if you make stupid decisions just because you were pressured by time or just because you felt like, let's do that, you set up yourself for trouble, especially if these are what I would call time bomb problems, which will not explode in your face right away, but they will hurt you in the long run somewhere along the way. So you have to make up your mind. You have to realize when it is a brave thing to do to make a quick decision, because sometimes it is, and this boils down to decision making again. and when it is stupid to make a quick decision. So something to think about. Especially that stupid decisions and trying to be very quick about certain things sets you up for a different path of trouble, which is actual rush implementation. This is commonly associated with crunch, where you're trying to make up for lost time, in a shorter span of time by working more, etc., which does not scale in terms of the impact that you make, because the fact that you work more does not necessarily mean you do more, because certain things again need time to mature, or simply people are not machines, so sometimes they're not capable of working more than n hours a day to provide meaningful contribution. So anytime you pretty much try to rush things, it might be that sometimes this works. It depends on how people work individually, how people feel, how people are motivated. But in the end, anything that is rushed is self-sabotage to a point. And this usually stems from decisions that were made beforehand that led you to all this trouble. Remember I mentioned deciding about features at the end of the game? There's a common problem with essential features of the game. I very much dislike what some people do, most people do, which is when you're planning a game, you have lists of, and especially at the end of development, you have lists of what is it that must be in the game and what we'd like to have in the game. Because what usually happens is the list that's called what we'd like to have in the game is pretty much discarded. Always, like there's never enough time to implement that. But if the game can ship without the what we'd like list, then what's the point of having that list at all? I mean, if you planned for it, that means it was essential to the experience that you envisioned. But if you can check it out and the game still works okay, that means it wasn't really necessary in the first place. So you have a coherent vision of what you want. I mean, you should evaluate it as a whole, and you should safeguard it as a whole rather than trying to partition it into something that's more and less preferable. And of course, this goes both ways, because you can cut essential features, which means you're castrating your game. Or on the other hand, you can push things in that have no bearing on the final quality of the game, and you just bloat it. More content does not, more work does not necessarily result in better quality of the game, and it's worth remembering that. And to finish it off, if you don't want your development team to look like that, it's worth remembering that any compromise and struggling with quality as a result of compromise does affect your team, does affect you as a developer individually, because it's not an easy thing to do to hurt your game. Just to be wary of that, because people are very fragile creatures. In the end, what you end up with as a result of all of that is lower degraded quality of the game and higher production costs, and just plain bad way to produce your games. And no one's really happy. Your game's not happy and you're not happy. And all of that is the result of making compromises or a compromise. Can it be justified at any point? It can, because sometimes we're just faced with a choice or lack of choice. We're pushed to the wall and there's nothing you can do, usually because of external, but sometimes of internal factors. You can't control everything. So it is so much more important to bear in mind that any compromise you made out of your free will early on, especially if you embed the compromise in your game's development, and it's a conscious choice, you are pretty much betting against yourself. You are betting against your game's best interests. And you should not do that if you can avoid it, because there will be plenty of opportunities down the road that will force you down that lane. Sorry for the technical troubles. To continue with my devil's advocate routine, if there's a choice and you make a there's a choice to do different things, and what you choose is compromise. It is self-sabotage, and it's especially bad if you do it early on in the development process. So a few pointers to top this whole discussion on how to avoid this. Never believe in something what's called unlimited resources, or don't believe that if you had unlimited resources, you would be able to avoid compromise, because that never happens. If you have too much resources, maybe you will spend 20 years working on your game instead of the 2 that you could have been spending. This boils down to don't be arrogant or ignorant, and be able to humbly understand your strengths and allocate the resources you have and might have accordingly to get your game to the finish line. Maybe you think, okay, so we always need to go for quality. Nothing else matters. As much as I applaud that position, and I think you should try to do that as much as you can, you should always figure out exactly what it is that you want to achieve. There is no point in pushing for things that are not really representable of the game vision that you have. And anytime you're faced with a problem, if something actually should be there, you just go for the simpler approach. And that doesn't mean that it has to be trivial. It just has to be simpler, because oftentimes even big problems have simpler solutions, and you shouldn't be discouraged by that. Have a good plan. That's always the recipe, but having a good plan in game development is very hard. So what I can advise is never trust your plan, and always keep replanning the plan so it's up to date, because you make a plan and in a week's time it's probably no longer valid. So it's worth revisiting it on a regular basis, updating your estimates and updating the expectations that you have from your team, from yourself, from the game. Because worst case, even if your plan gets derailed, which happens a lot, you might be aware of what problems you will face down the road. Of course, it would be great to be, know everything, understand everything, and try to fill all the gaps that might appear in the development process and the launch of the game. But in the end, you can't do that because no one is all-knowing. But what you can do is you can try to step out of your comfort zone as a developer and actually think like a player. This boils down to what I mentioned before, which is holistic approach. Think about the game as a whole. Think about the game as an experience that you want to offer, and think about it like a player. Are you enjoying it? Are there things missing? Are there things that are annoying, frustrating? You have to forget about being a developer for every now and then and think like a player. Otherwise, you will not be delivering a good game. And the final piece of advice is the holistic approach is what solves a lot of the compromise problems, because it makes you prepared. And apart from thinking like a player, which is easier said than done sometimes, it is very much supported by establishing a solid foundation and making sure the vision that you're trying to achieve and deliver is consistent, and understanding what it is at the core of your game that makes the difference and makes that experience outstanding. That way, even if you're forced to make compromises, which I hope you won't be, you will make smarter choices, and you will know when to reject a compromise, even if it costs you, because the price for the game's quality is too high, and you have to make someone else pay the price. And sometimes, it takes more of your time, it takes more of your budget. Sometimes there is sacrifices to be made, but they shouldn't be made at the point of game's quality. A good way to do that is to treat the game as a whole as a puzzle. Many individual pieces build the puzzle, like with the example of the house, but you don't really need all of them to be great. At the same time, you don't want the important ones to be terrible, because that will ruin the whole thing. So if you have a picture of the cat here, in both cases, the pizza cat is missing 6 puzzle pieces, but the one on the left, as you can see, it's obscuring his face, so you can't really see it's a cat. You can't really see its clever eyes. Whereas in the right one, the pieces missing are far away from the cat's face and any details that matter. And at the first glance, you probably don't even notice they're missing. And it's the same picture with the same amount of puzzles missing. So Why not opt for the right one instead of the left one, and not self-sabotaging? Avoid compromise whenever you can. Don't think it's easy. It's super hard. Sometimes out of necessity. Sometimes you're tempted to do this because maybe you're frustrated. All I can say for that is try your best, stay strong and brave, because game development is not easy. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes a mental toll. And but in the end, what you want to do is make all that sacrifice, all that work worth something. And that includes making sure that your game's quality is at its best as much as you can. So compromise is always a last resort, and never ever try to compromise early on, because that will embed compromise in your game and it will ruin your work, and you don't want that. Thank you very much. We have literally a minute for questions. So if someone has a quick question, I encourage you to ask them. Thank you very much for listening, and hope you weren't that scared, and you will not be afraid of facing compromises in the future.